The village of St. Mary Mead had awakened that morning to whispers, though few could say precisely what had set tongues wagging before the breakfast dishes were cleared. Miss Jane Marple, settling into her customary chair beneath the elm tree at the annual church fete, had already heard 3 different versions of the same curious tale from 3 different sources, each convinced they alone possessed the complete truth. The Morning Post, it seemed, had brought something rather more interesting than the usual circulars and bills. Mrs. Clement, the postmistress, had confided to the baker's wife that young Timothy Marsh had discovered a letter on the doorstep of Greenways Manor at dawn, sealed with old-fashioned red wax and addressed in handwriting that bore an uncanny resemblance to that of the late Colonel Fortescue. Dr. Haydock, when pressed by the vicar's wife, had admitted to being somewhat disturbed by the whole affair, particularly since the letter had most certainly not been there when he'd passed the manor gates on his evening rounds. Most peculiar of all, according to the grocer's boy who'd overheard the conversation at the post office, was that someone had seen a figure moving about the manor grounds well after midnight, though the household had retired hours earlier. Miss Marple adjusted her knitting and observed the gathering with the mild interest of someone who had learned that the most significant dramas often played out during the most ordinary occasions. The church fete proceeded with its usual gentle chaos. The White Elephant stall presided over by Mrs. Price Ridley with military precision, the jam and cake competition judged with diplomatic care by the vicar, and the inevitable arguments over the flower arrangements that would simmer quietly until next year's event provided fresh grievances. At the center of it all moved Mrs. Venetia Fortescue, the colonel's widow, her elegant figure draped in mourning black that somehow managed to appear fashionable rather than funereal. She had arrived precisely at noon, as was her custom, and had made her rounds with the practiced grace of someone fulfilling social obligations while maintaining appropriate distance. Miss Marple noted, however, that Mrs. Fortescue's usual composure seemed somewhat strained today, her smile requiring more effort than usual, her gloved hands betraying the slightest tremor when she thought herself unobserved. The mysterious letter, whatever its contents, had clearly reached its intended recipient. Young Mr. Geoffrey Fortescue, the colonel's nephew and heir to a modest trust fund, hovered near the tea tent with the restless energy of a man with something pressing on his mind. He'd been seen about the village rather more frequently since his uncle's death, though whether from filial duty or financial necessity remained a matter of some speculation among the more observant residents. Miss Marple had noticed him deep in conversation with Mr. Pemberton, the family solicitor, on more than one occasion, their discussions conducted in the hushed tones that suggested matters of some delicacy. Dr. Haydock, looking unusually grave for such a festive occasion, made his way through the crowd with the purposeful stride of a man on professional business. He paused briefly beside Mrs. Fortescue, their conversation too quiet to overhear, but marked by her sudden pallor and his concerned expression. Miss Marple observed this exchange with particular interest, noting the way Mrs. Fortescue's hand moved instinctively to her reticule, as though protecting something precious or dangerous within. The afternoon progressed with the measured pace of village life, punctuated by the usual small dramas, a minor dispute over the judging of the prize roses, a child's tears over a dropped ice cream, the gentle rivalry between competing cake recipes. Yet beneath this familiar rhythm, Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of tension, the kind that builds slowly before breaking unexpectedly. It was young Timothy Marsh who provided the catalyst. The boy had been helping to clear tables when he approached Mrs. Fortescue with the earnest directness of youth. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet gathering. "But I found something else this morning. Dropped near your gate it was. Thought you might want it back." He held out a small object that glinted silver in the afternoon sun. Mrs. Fortescue stared at the item in Timothy's palm with an expression of absolute horror. The color drained from her face so completely that Dr. Haydock stepped forward in alarm. But before he could reach her, she swayed once, pressed a hand to her throat, and collapsed among the scattered tea things with a crash that sent china flying and brought the entire fete to a stunned halt. Dr. Haydock was beside her in an instant, his fingers seeking a pulse that grew fainter even as he knelt. "Stand back, please," he commanded, his professional authority cutting through the shocked murmurs. But even as he spoke, Miss Marple could see in his expression the knowledge that his skills would not be needed. Mrs. Venetia Fortescue was dead. In the terrible silence that followed, Miss Marple's eyes moved from the silver object that had fallen from Timothy's hand, a distinctive cufflink bearing the Fortescue family crest, to the faces surrounding the tragic scene. She noted the genuine shock in most expressions, but also something else in one or two. A flash of what might have been relief, quickly suppressed, but not quite quickly enough for someone who had spent a lifetime observing the subtle variations of human nature. The letter delivered after midnight, it seemed, had carried consequences far more serious than anyone could have imagined. As the police were summoned and the crowd reluctantly dispersed, Miss Marple remained in her chair beneath the elm tree, her knitting forgotten in her lap, her mind already beginning to sort through the threads of what promised to be a most complex and tragic puzzle. The hush that follows sudden calamity settled over the church green like a heavy blanket, broken only by the measured footsteps of Inspector Slack as he arrived from Much Benham with the brisk efficiency that marked his approach to all matters requiring official attention. The inspector, a capable man whose impatience with village complications was legendary, surveyed the scene with the particular expression of someone who suspected that death had chosen an inconveniently public moment to make its appearance. Dr. Haydock straightened from his examination with the grave finality that needed no words, though Miss Marple observed that he seemed troubled by something beyond the obvious tragedy. Their whispered conference carried just far enough for her acute hearing to catch references to unusual coloration and a distinctive odor that seemed to perplex the good doctor, though Inspector Slack appeared more interested in the dramatic circumstances than in such medical minutiae. The questioning began with young Timothy Marsh, who found himself thrust into unwelcome prominence as the discoverer of both the mysterious letter and the fatal cufflink. His account, delivered with the straightforward honesty of youth, nevertheless contained subtle inconsistencies that escaped the inspector's notice but registered clearly with Miss Marple. Timothy insisted he had found both items at dawn, yet his description of the morning light suggested a somewhat later hour, and his mother had mentioned seeing him return from his paper round well before the time he claimed to have made these discoveries. The cufflink itself proved fascinating under closer examination. Mr. Pemberton, summoned from his hushed conversation with Geoffrey Fortescue, confirmed that it bore the authentic family crest and appeared to be part of a set that had belonged to the late colonel. Geoffrey, when shown the item, grew noticeably pale and denied any knowledge of how it might have come to be lying near his aunt's gate, his protest carrying the particular vehemence of someone defending rather too vigorously against an unspoken accusation. Inspector Slack's attention turned to Mrs. Fortescue's reticule, which Mrs. Price Ridley had efficiently tidied in the immediate aftermath of the collapse. The contents, laid out with methodical precision, revealed the usual feminine necessities but notably lacked the letter that Timothy had delivered that morning. Miss Marple, observing this development with mild interest, remarked quietly that she had distinctly seen Mrs. Fortescue place something papery into her bag after her conversation with Dr. Haydock, something that had caused her considerable distress. The missing letter became the focal point of increasingly intense speculation. Mrs. Bentz, the housekeeper at Greenways Manor, arrived with the weary competence of a woman accustomed to other people's crises. She confirmed that Timothy had indeed delivered a letter bearing an old-fashioned red wax seal, that she had taken it directly to her mistress, and that Mrs. Fortescue had recognized the handwriting immediately. The letter had accompanied Mrs. Fortescue to the fete, carefully guarded in her reticule, but had somehow vanished in the confusion following her collapse. Dr. Haydock, freed from his official duties, approached Miss Marple with the slightly harried expression of a man grappling with medical mysteries beyond his usual experience. His concerns about Mrs. Fortescue's condition extended far beyond simple cardiac arrest, he confided quietly. The slight blue tinge to her lips, the particular odor he had detected, even the rapidity with which she had succumbed, all suggested the possibility of poisoning, though Inspector Slack seemed satisfied with the explanation of shock-induced heart failure. The village, meanwhile, had erupted into the particular ferment of speculation that follows any dramatic event in a small community. Mrs. Clement, the postmistress, held forth on supernatural omens and midnight deliveries, while Mrs. Price Ridley proclaimed with authority that the entire affair reeked of deliberate malice. The vicar attributed the tragedy to moral decline and hidden sins, his sermons for the coming weeks practically writing themselves in the face of such providential material. Geoffrey Fortescue's behavior throughout the afternoon struck Miss Marple as particularly revealing. His nervous energy, barely contained beneath a veneer of appropriate grief, manifested in restless gestures and furtive glances toward the spot where his aunt had fallen. His heated discussion with Mr. Pemberton had ended with the young man striding off toward the village with urgent purpose, leaving the solicitor standing by the church gate with a deeply troubled expression. Mrs. Clement later confided to Miss Marple that Geoffrey had been making curious inquiries about postal services, particularly whether it was possible to determine when a letter had been posted and whether any unusual activity had been recorded in recent days. The postmistress had found nothing irregular in her official records, but as she observed with meaningful emphasis, a letter delivered by hand in the dead of night would leave no trace in any official documentation. Miss Marple absorbed these various threads of information with the patient attention of someone accustomed to finding patterns in seemingly random events. The mysterious letter with its authentic-looking seal and familiar handwriting, the convenient appearance of the Colonel's cufflink at precisely the moment calculated to cause maximum shock, the suspicious circumstances of Mrs. Fortescue's death, and the increasingly nervous behavior of those who stood to benefit from her demise, all suggested a puzzle far more complex than Inspector Slack's straightforward explanation would accommodate. As the church bells chimed the hour and the remnants of the fete were cleared away with subdued efficiency, Miss Marple gathered her knitting with the thoughtful air of someone whose afternoon had provided considerably more material for reflection than the usual village entertainment. The question that occupied her mind was not simply who had killed Mrs. Fortescue, but who possessed both the knowledge of family history and the cold calculation necessary to orchestrate such an elaborate and public deception. The answer, she suspected, lay not in the obvious motives of inheritance and financial gain, but in the deeper currents of resentment and betrayal that flowed beneath the placid surface of village life. The investigation was only beginning, but already the careful observer could detect the subtle signs that someone in St. Mary Mead was not quite what they seemed to be. The evening that settled over St. Mary Mead carried with it an atmosphere of barely suppressed tension, as though the village itself sensed that the afternoon's tragedy had been merely the visible culminations of darker currents that had been flowing beneath its placid surface for some time. Miss Marple, having declined the vicar's wife's well-meaning invitation to tea and consolation, found herself drawn instead to a more purposeful sort of evening constitutional, one that would take her past the cottages and lanes where the day's principal actors were presumably grappling with the implications of Mrs. Fortescue's sudden death. Her first destination, though she would have described it as purely coincidental, was the Marsh cottage, where young Timothy sat on the front step with the particular dejection of a boy who had discovered that adult affairs were far more complicated and dangerous than he had imagined. His mother, bustling about with the nervous energy of someone expecting official attention, welcomed Miss Marple's gentle presence with obvious relief. It took very little encouragement for Timothy to unburden himself of the secret that had been weighing on his conscience since the morning's events. The story that emerged was far more complex than his original account. Timothy confessed, with the painful honesty of youth confronted with consequences, that he had not simply found the letter and cufflink at dawn. Instead, he had been approached near the village green by a gentleman in a dark overcoat who had spoken to him with a particular authority that made children listen without question. The man had been polite, well-spoken, and had offered Timothy a half-crown for what he described as a harmless errand that would provide a pleasant surprise for Mrs. Fortescue. Most significantly, Timothy recalled that the gentleman had walked with a careful, measured gait that suggested he was concealing a limp or some other impediment. The boy's description of the man's gloves, which had carried the distinctive scent of tobacco and something sharp like metal polish, provided additional details that Miss Marple filed away, with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to finding patterns in seemingly random observations. Armed with this new information, Miss Marple made her way to Greenway's Manor, where Mrs. Bence admitted her with the weary gratitude of a woman managing a household in crisis. The housekeeper's offer of tea in the morning room provided the perfect opportunity for Miss Marple to request a moment's rest in the cooler atmosphere of the late Colonel's study, a suggestion that Mrs. Bence accepted without suspicion. The study revealed itself to be a treasure trove of subtle evidence that had escaped official notice. The Colonel's writing desk, with its well-worn leather surface and collection of correspondence materials, showed clear signs of recent use. Miss Marple's experienced eye detected the faint impressions on the blotting paper that suggested recent letter writing, and a careful examination revealed the ghostly outline of "My dear V," pressed into the absorbent surface. More tellingly, fragments of red sealing wax clung to the groove beside the seal tray, and the Colonel's signet ring rested in its customary place, readily available to anyone with access to the room. The implications were clear to someone with Miss Marple's understanding of human nature. The mysterious letter had been composed not by the dead Colonel, but by someone with intimate knowledge of his habits, access to his writing materials, and the cold calculation necessary to exploit a grieving widow's emotional vulnerabilities. The theatrical timing of the cufflink's appearance, delivered by an innocent child who had been carefully coached in his role, suggested a mind capable of elaborate deception and ruthless manipulation. Meanwhile, Dr. Haydock's growing unease about the medical aspects of Mrs. Fortescue's death had led him to document his observations with increasing precision. The subtle signs he had noted, the rapidity of her collapse, the faint discoloration of her lips, and the barely perceptible scent that had reminded him of bitter almonds, all pointed toward the possibility of poisoning rather than simple cardiac arrest. His request for a formal post-mortem examination had been met with Inspector Slack's characteristic impatience, but the doctor's professional integrity demanded that his concerns be officially recorded. The question of the missing letter had grown more intriguing with each passing hour. Miss Marple had observed Mrs. Fortescue's protective gesture toward her reticule after her conversation with Dr. Haydock, and the systematic efficiency with which the scene had been cleared suggested that someone had taken deliberate advantage of the confusion to remove the incriminating document. The letter's contents, whatever they might have been, had clearly been designed to provoke exactly the sort of emotional shock that had proven fatal to Mrs. Fortescue's fragile constitution. Geoffrey Fortescue's increasingly erratic behavior provided additional cause for concern. His urgent departure from the fete, his consultations with the family solicitor, and his obvious agitation when questioned about family matters all suggested a young man operating under considerable pressure. His denial of knowledge regarding the cufflink's appearance carried the particular vehemence of someone defending against accusations that struck uncomfortably close to the truth. As Miss Marple completed her evening's observations and settled into her sitting room with her knitting, she found herself contemplating the psychology of whoever had orchestrated the day's events. The elaborate staging, the careful manipulation of innocent parties, and the cold calculation required to exploit both emotional vulnerabilities and financial motivations all pointed toward someone who moved freely within the village community, trusted and unsuspected, using that very invisibility as both weapon and shield. The pattern emerging from her investigations suggested that Mrs. Fortescue's death had been neither accidental nor spontaneous, but rather the carefully planned culmination of a scheme that had taken advantage of intimate family knowledge, professional access, and the predictable reactions of a small community to orchestrate what appeared to be a perfect crime. The morning brought with it the particular weight of official confirmation that transforms village speculation into criminal investigation. Dr. Haydock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage shortly after breakfast, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by the grave expression of a medical man confronting deliberate evil. The preliminary toxicology report from the county hospital had confirmed his worst suspicions. Mrs. Venetia Fortescue had indeed been poisoned, a lethal dose of cyanide administered with surgical precision during what should have been a pleasant afternoon at the church fete. Inspector Slack, summoned from Much Benham with reinforcements and a considerably altered perspective on the case, found himself grappling with the uncomfortable reality that his initial dismissal of foul play had been dangerously premature. The inspector's preference for straightforward crimes with obvious motives now collided with the theatrical complexity of a murder that had been orchestrated with almost taunting deliberation. The mysterious letter, the perfectly timed appearance of the cufflink, and the public nature of Mrs. Fortescue's death all pointed to a mind capable of elaborate planning and ruthless execution. Geoffrey Fortescue, inevitably, became the focal point of official suspicion. His financial difficulties were well documented. His relationship with his aunt had been strained by disagreements over his trust fund, and his nervous behavior since the tragedy suggested guilt of some variety. When questioned at the makeshift police headquarters in the village hall, Geoffrey presented a picture of agitated defensiveness that did little to improve his position. His alibi for the crucial moments when the poison must have been administered was frustratingly vague. Claims of having been around the stalls and speaking to various people without being able to identify specific witnesses who could corroborate his whereabouts. Miss Marple, observing these developments with her characteristic blend of sympathy and analytical precision, found herself troubled by several inconsistencies that seemed to escape official notice. Geoffrey's guilt, while apparent, appeared to center more on knowledge than action. His heated discussions with Mr. Pemberton and his urgent inquiries about postal services suggested a young man trying to understand events rather than one attempting to cover his tracks after committing murder. More significantly, Timothy Marsh's description of the mysterious gentleman who had recruited him for the letter delivery continued to nag at Miss Marple's orderly mind. The boy's account of a careful, measured gait suggesting physical impediment, combined with the distinctive sense of tobacco and metal polish, painted a picture that did not quite align with Geoffrey's characteristics. While the young man was certainly nervous and financially pressed, he showed no signs of the methodical precision that had characterized the crime's planning and execution. A discreet conversation with Mr. Pemberton revealed information that cast the entire situation in a more complex light. The family solicitor, clearly distressed by recent events, confirmed that Mrs. Fortescue had indeed made significant alterations to her will only weeks before her death. The new provisions substantially reduced Geoffrey's inheritance while establishing charitable trusts and, most intriguingly, arranging for the donation of certain family documents to the County Historical Society. These papers, according to Pemberton's careful explanation, included correspondence and personal effects that Mrs. Fortescue had discovered among her late husband's belongings. The solicitor's reluctant admission that these changes had not been entirely confidential, that certain inquiries had been made by interested parties regarding the estate's disposition, suggested that knowledge of the new will's contents might have extended beyond the immediate family circle. This revelation transformed the investigation's focus from simple inheritance disputes to more complex questions of family secrets and long-buried resentments. Miss Marple's attention was particularly caught by Pemberton's mention of Alistair Finch, a distant cousin who had been disinherited by the late Colonel Fortescue under circumstances that remained diplomatically vague. Finch, described as a reclusive former military man with a pronounced limp from an old war injury, possessed several characteristics that aligned disturbingly well with Timothy's description of his mysterious contact. His reputation for meticulous attention to detail, combined with his known habit of polishing antique military memorabilia, provided potential explanations for the distinctive scents that had clung to the gentleman's gloves. The missing letter remained the crucial piece of evidence that could unlock the entire puzzle. Its systematic removal from Mrs. Fortescue's reticule during the confusion following her collapse suggested someone with both the presence of mind to act quickly and the intimate knowledge necessary to recognize its significance. The letter's contents, whatever they might have been, had clearly been crafted to exploit Mrs. Fortescue's emotional vulnerabilities while providing the psychological shock necessary to mask the poison's effects. Dr. Haydock's continued analysis of the crime's medical aspects revealed additional disturbing details. The poison had been administered with sophisticated knowledge of both chemistry and human psychology, timed to coincide with emotional trauma that would provide a convenient explanation for Mrs. Fortescue's collapse. The method suggested someone with access to specialized knowledge and the cold calculation necessary to exploit a grieving widow's vulnerabilities for murderous purposes. As the village settled into the uncomfortable rhythm of living under official investigation, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the psychology of whoever had orchestrated these events. The elaborate staging, the careful manipulation of innocent parties like young Timothy, and the theatrical timing of each revelation all pointed towards someone who moved freely within the community, trusted and unsuspected, using their very respectability as both weapon and shield. The investigation was approaching a critical juncture where the killer's confidence in their elaborate deception might lead them to make the sort of mistake that would expose their carefully constructed facade. Miss Marple suspected that the answer lay not in the obvious motives of inheritance and financial gain, but in the deeper currents of resentment and betrayal that had been flowing beneath St. Mary Mead's placid surface for far longer than anyone had imagined. The morning's grim confirmation of deliberate murder had transformed the gentle rhythms of village investigation into something altogether more urgent. Though Miss Marple maintained her characteristic air of quiet observation as she made her way past the church green where Inspector Slack's men continued their methodical search. It was near the brazier behind the tea tent, where paper scraps and debris from the previous day's festivities had been consigned to the flames, that her practiced eye caught sight of something the official searchers had overlooked. With the careful precision of someone accustomed to retrieving dropped stitches, she extracted a fragment of heavy paper that the fire had not quite consumed, its edges charred black but its center still bearing the unmistakable salutation, "My dear V." Written in the distinctive hand she had observed pressed into the blotting paper at Greenway's Manor. The fragment bore additional evidence of its significance, a smear of crimson wax along one unburnt edge, the same distinctive shade and texture as the sealing materials she had noted in Colonel Fortescue's study. Inspector Slack, when presented with this discovery, accepted it with the grudging acknowledgement of a man learning to appreciate evidence he might previously have dismissed, though his muttered observation that "me dear" could be addressed to any number of people suggested he had not yet grasped the full implications of what Miss Marple had uncovered. Dr. Haydock's continued analysis of the medical aspects of Mrs. Fortescue's death provided the crucial insight that transformed speculation into certainty. His troubled confession that the poison had seemed to act with unusual rapidity, almost as if she breathed it, led Miss Marple to inquire gently about the victim's customary responses to emotional distress. The doctor's sudden recollection of a small cut-glass bottle among the contents of Mrs. Fortescue's reticule opened an entirely new avenue of investigation, particularly when Miss Marple observed with apparent innocence that smelling salts could indeed be so very reviving one moment, so very final the next, in certain hands. The bottle itself proved to be in the efficient custody of Mrs. Price Ridley, who had removed it from the reticule to keep it safe, with the particular authority of someone who trusted neither police efficiency nor public discretion with valuable items. Miss Marple's offer to serve as messenger was accepted with the relief of someone eager to discharge an unwelcome responsibility, and her subsequent examination of the bottle in the privacy of her own kitchen confirmed her growing suspicions. The sweet, dangerous scent that rose from the innocuous-looking container bore no resemblance to the sharp, reviving properties of legitimate-smelling salts, instead carrying the distinctive aroma that Dr. Haydock would later identify as containing traces of cyanide compounds. The investigation into Alistair Finch's background revealed layers of complexity that cast the entire tragedy in a more sinister light. Miss Marple's discreet inquiries into military records and family correspondence uncovered the bitter history between Finch and the late Colonel Fortescue, a friendship destroyed by accusations of cowardice during a particularly brutal engagement that had left Finch permanently disabled and socially ostracized. The Colonel's testimony at the subsequent military inquiry had effectively ended Finch's career and social standing, transforming him from trusted comrade to embittered outcast within the span of a single devastating afternoon. More significantly, the family papers that Mrs. Fortescue had discovered among her late husband's effects and planned to donate to the County Historical Society apparently contained additional evidence of the circumstances surrounding Finch's disgrace. Her decision to make these documents public would have exposed the very secrets that Finch had spent decades attempting to suppress, providing a motive far more compelling than simple financial gain or inheritance disputes. When Miss Marple encountered Finch at his cottage, and ostensibly to inquire about a rare variety of rose, she found a man whose careful movements and distinctive habits aligned disturbingly well with young Timothy's description of his mysterious contact. His pronounced limp, the result of his war injury, his meticulous attention to detail evident in his polished military memorabilia, and the particular scents of tobacco and metal polish that clung to his gloves, all provided circumstantial evidence that was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. Geoffrey Fortescue, meanwhile, continued to present a picture of genuine distress rather than calculated guilt. His frantic search of the crime scene, while clumsy and desperate, demonstrated the behavior of someone seeking answers rather than attempting to conceal evidence. His revelation to Miss Marple that his aunt had habitually used smelling salts at any unpleasantness and had recently mislaid and then recovered her bottle from the hall table provided crucial information about the killer's method and opportunity. The timing of recent events began to align with disturbing precision. Mrs. Fortescue's discovery of additional family papers, her decision to alter her will and donate sensitive documents to the Historical Society, and Finch's increasingly agitated behavior all suggested a carefully orchestrated campaign that had culminated in murder when other methods of suppression had failed. Dr. Haydock's analysis of the poisoning method revealed the sophisticated knowledge required to transform an innocent medicinal aid into a lethal weapon. The precise timing and dosage had been calculated to exploit the emotional shock of receiving the forged letter, while providing a convenient explanation for Mrs. Fortescue's sudden collapse. The method suggested someone with access to both specialized chemical knowledge and detailed understanding of the victim's habits and vulnerabilities. As evening approached and the official investigation continued to focus on the obvious suspect, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the psychology of long-nursed grievances and the particular bitterness that could transform legitimate hurt into murderous obsession. The elaborate staging of the crime, from the forged letter delivered by an innocent child to the theatrical timing of the cufflink's appearance, all pointed to a mind capable of patient planning and ruthless execution. The pattern emerging from her investigations suggested that Mrs. Fortescue's death had been the culmination of a campaign of psychological warfare that had begun with her discovery of the family papers and had escalated through carefully orchestrated stages designed to maximize both emotional impact and legal confusion. The killer had moved freely within the village community, trusted and unsuspected, using their very respectability as both weapon and shield in a game of... The afternoon brought with it a subtle shift in the investigation's momentum, as Miss Marple found herself drawn once again to Greenway's Manor, where Mrs. Bence had been struggling to maintain the household's dignity amid the chaos of official inquiry. The housekeeper, grateful for sympathetic company, proved remarkably forthcoming about details that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now assumed darker implications in light of the confirmed poisoning. Mrs. Bence's recollection of recent events painted a disturbing picture of calculated preparation. She remembered distinctly that Mrs. Fortescue had been quite distressed the previous week when her smelling salts bottle had gone missing from her reticule, only to turn up mysteriously on the hall table near the front door. She was so particular about that bottle, Miss Marple, the housekeeper confided, always kept it close at hand since her heart troubles began. When it disappeared for those 2 days, she was quite beside herself, checking every room twice over. More significantly, Mrs. Bence recalled that Alistair Finch had paid an unexpected visit to the manor just the day before the fete, ostensibly to inquire about some family genealogy matter he claimed to be researching. The visit had been brief and somewhat tense, with Mrs. Fortescue mentioning her plans to donate the Colonel's papers to the Historical Society. Finch's reaction, according to the observant housekeeper, had been one of barely concealed alarm, though he had maintained his usual stiff courtesy throughout the encounter. Miss Marple's gentle inquiry about a household security revealed that Finch retained a key to the manor from years past, when the Colonel had granted him access for his genealogical research. Despite the bitter estrangement that had followed their falling out, the key had never been formally requested back, an oversight that now seemed far from innocent. The hall table, where the smelling salts had mysteriously reappeared, was positioned directly inside the front entrance, easily accessible to anyone with legitimate access to the house. Dr. Haydock's continued analysis of the poisoning method had revealed additional disturbing details about the sophistication required for such a crime. The cyanide compound had been introduced with precise knowledge of both chemistry and human psychology, designed to activate when Mrs. Fortescue inevitably reached for her customary relief during emotional distress. The timing suggested someone intimately familiar with her habits and medical vulnerabilities, knowledge that extended far beyond casual acquaintance. Inspector Slack's persistent focus on Geoffrey Fortescue was beginning to show strain as the evidence accumulated in directions his straightforward approach found difficult to accommodate. While the young man's financial difficulties and obvious guilt about something made him a convenient suspect, his lack of access to specialized chemical knowledge and his absence from the village during the crucial preparation period suggested his involvement was peripheral rather than central to the actual murder. Miss Marple's afternoon visit to Finch's cottage was conducted with her characteristic blend of innocent curiosity and sharp observation. She found him in his study, surrounded by meticulously maintained military artifacts, each piece polished to mirror brightness with the obsessive care of a man who found order in small perfections. His greeting was correct but strained, his eyes betraying the wariness of someone expecting unwelcome questions. The conversation began innocuously enough, with Miss Marple admiring his collection and commenting on the Colonel's distinguished service record. Finch's responses grew increasingly defensive as she gently steered the discussion toward family history and the importance of preserving accurate records for future generations. His hands, she noted, bore faint traces of what appeared to be red wax beneath the fingernails, despite his claim of having spent recent days in solitary reading. When Miss Marple mentioned, with apparent casualness, that Mrs. Fortescue had been quite excited about sharing certain family documents with historians, Finch's composure cracked visibly. His voice took on a bitter edge as he spoke of misguided attempts to resurrect old scandals and the cruelty of exposing private family matters to public scrutiny. The vehemence of his reaction suggested wounds that had never properly healed, grievances that had festered in isolation until they had transformed into something far more dangerous. Most tellingly, Finch volunteered an elaborate alibi for the day of the fete without being asked, describing in precise detail his solitary walk to the neighboring village and his quiet evening with a book. The specificity of his account, complete with timestamps and weather observations, carried the rehearsed quality of someone who had prepared for exactly such questions. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, she noticed Finch's walking stick propped beside his chair, its silver head bearing traces of the same red wax she had observed under his fingernails. His explanation that he had been repairing an old letter seal seemed plausible enough, yet the timing struck her as remarkably coincidental given recent events. The pattern emerging from her investigations pointed inexorably toward a mind capable of patient, methodical planning, combined with intimate knowledge of both the victim's vulnerabilities and the family secrets that had motivated the crime. The elaborate staging, from the forged letter's emotional impact to the perfectly timed appearance of the colonel's cufflink, demonstrated not merely criminal intent, but a desire for psychological revenge that had been decades in the making. As evening approached, and the village settled into its uneasy routine under the shadow of murder, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the particular psychology of long-nursed grievances and the dangerous transformation that could occur when legitimate hurt evolved into obsessive hatred. The killer had demonstrated remarkable patience and skill, but such elaborate schemes often contained within them the seeds of their own destruction, requiring only the right pressure applied at the crucial moment to bring the entire carefully constructed edifice tumbling down. Revenge that had been decades in the making. The night that settled over St. Mary Mead carried with it an expectant quality, as though the village itself sensed that the afternoon's revelations were merely prelude to darker developments yet to come. Miss Marple had just settled into her evening routine when the urgent rapping at her door announced Mrs. Clement, the postmistress, whose usual composure had been replaced by the breathless agitation of someone bearing news too significant for ordinary social protocols. The lights burning in Mr. Pemberton's office windows at such an unseemly hour, combined with the arrival of Inspector Slack's motor and the hurried consultations visible through the solicitor's windows, suggested that the investigation had taken yet another unexpected turn. The scene that greeted Miss Marple at the solicitor's office presented a carefully orchestrated tableau of apparent burglary, though her experienced eye immediately detected the subtle signs that distinguished genuine desperation from calculated performance. Papers scattered with theatrical precision, drawers open just enough to suggest hasty searching, and the splintered lock on the inner door that bore the particular marks of someone familiar with the mechanism rather than a genuine intruder's crude force all spoke to a mind that understood the importance of creating convincing appearances. Mr. Pemberton himself sat pale and shaken behind his desk, a handkerchief pressed to the bruise at his temple, his account of the evening's events delivered with the careful precision of a man who had rehearsed his story during the anxious minutes before help arrived. The mysterious letter that had summoned him to his office after midnight bore the now familiar characteristics of the forged correspondence that had precipitated Mrs. Fortescue's death. The old-fashioned red wax seal, the careful imitation of Colonel Fortescue's handwriting, and the urgent tone designed to compel immediate action despite the unusual circumstances. Most significantly, the missing documents from the tin box that Mrs. Fortescue had designated for donation to the County Historical Society provided the clearest indication yet of the killer's true motivations. The stolen envelope, according to Pemberton's careful inventory, had contained the very papers that would have exposed the circumstances surrounding Alistair Finch's military disgrace, documents that Mrs. Fortescue had discovered among her late husband's effects and had intended to make public as part of her commitment to historical accuracy. Miss Marple's examination of the crime scene revealed details that escaped official notice but confirmed her growing understanding of the perpetrator's methods. The droplet of red sealing wax near the door, the faint scent of disinfectant overlaying tobacco that lingered in the air, and the brass door handle that had been wiped clean with suspicious thoroughness all pointed to someone who moved with practiced efficiency while attempting to obscure their identity through misdirection and false clues. Geoffrey Fortescue's presence at the scene, summoned by yet another anonymous note that he had foolishly destroyed in irritation, provided additional evidence of the killer's sophisticated approach to manipulation. The young man's genuine distress and obvious confusion contrasted sharply with the calculated precision of the crime itself, suggesting that he remained an unwitting pawn in a larger game rather than its principal architect. Dr. Haydock's observation about the fresh disinfectant scent proved particularly illuminating when combined with Miss Marple's recollection of similar odors during her visit to Finch's cottage. The killer's attempt to associate themselves with distinctive scents while simultaneously taking precautions to avoid leaving physical evidence demonstrated the sort of psychological sophistication that had characterized every aspect of the elaborate scheme from its inception. The missing notebook, described by Pemberton as one of Colonel Fortescue's personal journals containing references to the military inquiry that had destroyed Finch's career, represented the final piece of evidence that could have provided posthumous vindication for the disgraced officer. Yet rather than welcome this opportunity for public exoneration, Finch had apparently viewed the revelation as a fresh humiliation, preferring the privacy of his bitterness to the public acknowledgement of his victimization. Inspector Slack's renewed focus on Finch as the primary suspect reflected the weight of accumulating evidence, though Miss Marple recognized that the killer's confidence in their elaborate deception might yet prove to be their greatest vulnerability. The visit to Finch's cottage revealed a man whose careful composure was beginning to show subtle signs of strain, his repeated alibi delivered with the mechanical precision of someone who had rehearsed every detail while his surroundings betrayed evidence of recent activity that contradicted his claims of solitary reading. The red sealing wax on Finch's desk, with its telltale signs of recent use, provided the most damning evidence yet of his involvement in the forged correspondence. Miss Marple's trained eye detected the crucial flaw in his deception. While the wax and seal appeared authentic, the impression lacked the characteristic burr that marked every genuine seal, made by Colonel Fortescue's signet ring, a tiny imperfection that Finch had either failed to notice or had been unable to replicate in his careful forgery. As the investigation approached its climax, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the particular tragedy of a man whose legitimate grievances had been transformed by decades of isolation and resentment into something far more dangerous than simple bitterness. The elaborate staging of Mrs. Fortescue's murder, the calculated manipulation of innocent witnesses like young Timothy, and now the desperate attempt to eliminate the documentary evidence of his disgrace, all pointed to a mind that had spent years perfecting the art of revenge, while losing sight of any possibility of genuine justice or redemption. The pattern of evidence now suggested that Finch's campaign of deception was approaching a critical juncture where his confidence in his elaborate scheme might lead him to make the sort of mistake that would expose his carefully constructed facade and bring his decades-long quest for revenge to its inevitable and tragic conclusion. The morning that followed the burglary at Mr. Pemberton's office brought with it a clarity of purpose that Miss Marple had been quietly cultivating throughout the investigation, as though the various threads of evidence and observation were finally weaving themselves into a pattern that demanded decisive action. She sat in her morning room with the particular stillness of someone whose mind was working with methodical precision, reviewing each element of the case with the patient attention she might give to a complex piece of knitting where one dropped stitch could unravel the entire work. The accumulation of evidence against Alistair Finch had reached a point where Inspector Slack considered the case all but closed, yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the very completeness of that evidence. The theatrical precision with which each incriminating detail had emerged, from the forged letter delivered by young Timothy to the perfectly timed appearance of the Colonel's cufflink, suggested a mind that understood not merely the mechanics of murder, but the psychology of investigation itself. Someone had been orchestrating events with the confident expectation that official attention would follow predictable patterns, focusing on obvious motives while overlooking subtler possibilities. Her careful review of Dr. Haydick's role throughout the investigation revealed a pattern of behavior that, while perfectly appropriate on the surface, assumed darker implications when examined through the lens of criminal possibility. His immediate availability at each crucial moment, his ready explanations for complex medical phenomena, and his detailed knowledge of both Mrs. Fortescue's vulnerabilities and the village's social dynamics had made him an invaluable consultant to the investigation. Yet these same qualifications would have equipped him admirably for the commission of the crime itself, providing both the technical expertise and the professional cover necessary for such an elaborate deception. Miss Marple's decision to test her growing suspicions required the sort of careful preparation that had characterized her most successful interventions in criminal matters. She arranged her afternoon with a particular attention to detail that marked all her important undertakings, beginning with a seemingly casual visit to Mrs. Bence at Greenways Manor. The conversation, conducted over tea in the morning room, provided the perfect opportunity to confirm several crucial details about the timing of recent events and the accessibility of certain household items that had figured prominently in the crime. Armed with this information, Miss Marple made her way to Dr. Haydick's surgery during his customary afternoon break, her arrival timed to coincide with the quiet period when his receptionist would be absent and their conversation could proceed without interruption. She found him in his consulting room, organizing medical supplies with the methodical precision that characterized all his professional activities, his greeting warm with the particular affection he had always shown for her gentle presence in village affairs. "Such a relief that the investigation seems to be reaching its conclusion," Miss Marple observed, settling into the chair reserved for patients with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had been a frequent visitor over the years. "Poor Mr. Finch must be under considerable strain, knowing that suspicion has focused so heavily upon him. Though I confess, Doctor, I find myself puzzled by certain aspects of the case that don't seem to align quite as neatly as one might expect." Dr. Haydick's response carried the professional reassurance she had anticipated. His explanation of the evidence against Finch delivered with the authority of someone who had been intimately involved in analyzing each development. Yet Miss Marple noted subtle signs of tension beneath his composed demeanor, a slight tightening around his eyes when she mentioned specific details about the timing of Mrs. Fortescue's collapse and the precision with which the poison had been administered. "The medical aspects of the case have been particularly fascinating," she continued, her tone carrying the innocent curiosity that had served her so well in previous investigations. "The way the cyanide was introduced into the smelling salts required such precise knowledge of chemical interactions and dosages. One would almost think it was the work of someone with professional medical training rather than a bitter amateur seeking crude revenge." The doctor's hands, busy with organizing pharmaceutical samples, paused almost imperceptibly at her observation, his explanation of how such knowledge might be acquired through military service or amateur chemistry carrying a defensive undertone that had not been present in his earlier responses. Miss Marple filed away this reaction with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to reading the subtle variations of human behavior under pressure. "And then there's the curious matter of young Timothy's description of his mysterious contact," she observed, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked. "The boy was quite specific about certain details, the gentleman's careful gait, the distinctive scents of disinfectant and metal polish. Such an odd combination, don't you think? Almost as though someone had been handling medical instruments and then attempted to mask the odor with something else entirely." Dr. Haydick's composure, so carefully maintained throughout the investigation, began to show the first signs of genuine strain as Miss Marple's gentle questioning continued to probe the inconsistencies that had been troubling her analytical mind. His explanations became more elaborate, his professional authority more pronounced, as though he were attempting to overwhelm her observations with the weight of his medical expertise and social standing. Yet Miss Marple persisted with the patient determination that had characterized all her most successful investigations, her questions growing more specific as she watched for the telltale signs of psychological pressure that would either confirm her suspicions or expose the flaws in her reasoning. The moment was approaching when the careful facade that had protected the real killer would either hold firm under scrutiny or begin to crumble under the weight of accumulated evidence and relentless, gentle pressure. The afternoon light filtering through the surgery windows seemed to sharpen as Miss Marple prepared to apply the final test that would determine whether her understanding of the case was correct, or whether she had been led astray by the very complexity that had made this crime so difficult to unravel from its inception. The afternoon light filtering through the surgery windows seemed to intensify as Miss Marple continued her gentle but relentless examination of the case's inconsistencies, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm while Dr. Haydock's professional composure showed increasing signs of strain. The careful reorganization of his medical supplies had become almost compulsive, his hands seeking familiar tasks while his mind grappled with the implications of her observations. "The timing troubles me most of all, Doctor," Miss Marple observed, with the particular mildness that marked her most dangerous moments. Mrs. Bence was quite specific about when Mrs. Fortescue's smelling salts went missing, 2 full days during which the poor woman was beside herself with worry. Just long enough, one might say, for someone with the proper chemical knowledge to modify the contents and return the bottle to where it would be found. Someone who understood her habits intimately, who could predict with medical precision exactly when she would reach for her customary relief. Dr. Haydock's attempt to redirect attention toward Finch's obvious guilt met with Miss Marple's persistent focus on details that seemed to accumulate with inexorable logic. Of course, Mr. Finch had compelling motives, she agreed readily. But access, Doctor, that's quite another matter. Who else but a trusted medical professional could come and go from Greenway's Manor without question? Who else would Mrs. Fortescue welcome into her private chambers, allow to examine her medications, confide her vulnerabilities to? The doctor's professional authority asserted itself more forcefully, his explanations growing elaborate as he attempted to demonstrate how such intimate knowledge might be acquired through casual observation. Yet Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hands, the unconscious gesture of a man whose carefully maintained control was beginning to require conscious effort. "And then there's young Timothy's description," she continued, her voice maintaining its conversational warmth. "A gentleman with a careful, measured gait suggesting physical impediment, carrying distinctive scents of disinfectant and metal polish. Such an unusual combination, though I suppose someone who worked regularly with surgical instruments might carry just such odors. The measured gait could easily be affected by someone wishing to mimic another's distinctive limp, particularly if they knew it would serve as a convenient misdirection. The transformation in Dr. Haydock's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable to someone with Miss Marple's experience in reading human nature under pressure. His professional mask remained in place, but beneath it she could detect the particular tension of a man whose elaborate deception was being systematically dismantled. "The red sealing wax on your desk yesterday was most illuminating," Miss Marple observed, pausing to examine a complex section of her knitting. "I noticed it bore a peculiar smoothness to the impression, lacking the distinct burr of the Colonel's actual signet ring. A tiny detail, perhaps, but one that only someone unfamiliar with the exact specifics of the ring would miss in their haste to create a convincing forgery." Dr. Haydock's final attempt at maintaining innocence came with desperate authority. "Miss Marple, surely you cannot be suggesting that I'm suggesting, Doctor, that Mrs. Fortescue's new will concerned more than simple inheritance disputes. Mr. Pemberton confided that she intended to donate certain family documents to the Historical Society, papers concerning the military inquiry that ruined Mr. Finch. But those documents contained correspondence revealing your role in assisting the colonel in covering up certain details about that incident. Details that would have shattered your reputation, exposed you as complicit in a decades-old deception. The color drained from Dr. Haydock's face as Miss Marple's gentle persistence exposed the fundamental flaw in his elaborate scheme. He had counted on his professional standing to place him above suspicion, had used his medical expertise to both commit the crime and guide the investigation away from himself. "You were perfectly positioned, Doctor," Miss Marple continued with quiet certainty. "First on the scene, able to examine Mrs. Fortescue, note the unusual symptoms while downplaying their significance to Inspector Slack, and the missing letter from her reticule. Who else, in that moment of confusion, with professional authority and everyone's complete trust, could have removed it so easily?" Dr. Haydock slowly sank into his chair, his hands trembling visibly as the weight of accumulated evidence overwhelmed his defenses. "She would have ruined me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "After all these years, after building everything back, becoming respected in this community, she was going to expose it all. My part in the cover-up, the false testimony I gave to protect Fortescue and save my own career. It was all in those letters." His eyes held a chilling blend of fear and calculation. Finch was the perfect scapegoat. Everyone knew his bitterness, his motives. I simply provided the evidence, the forged letter, the cufflink, all perfectly timed to be discovered, and the smelling salts. So simple, so effective. Who would suspect the village doctor whose concerns seemed so genuine? Miss Marple regarded him with profound sadness, recognizing the tragedy of human weakness laid bare. "A careful plan, Doctor, but even the most elaborate deceptions have their flaws, especially when they rely too heavily on misdirection. You underestimated the power of quiet observation and the persistent nature of truth." The silence that followed carried the weight of confession and shattered trust. Miss Marple knew that Inspector Slack would arrive soon, summoned by arrangements she had made before her visit. The respected village doctor had woven a web of deceit that had finally unraveled under gentle but relentless pressure, exposing how a long-buried secret could transform a healer into a killer. The measured footsteps approaching the surgery door announced Inspector Slack's arrival with the punctuality that Miss Marple had anticipated. His entrance marked by the particular confusion of a man whose straightforward investigation had been overturned by revelations he had not expected. Dr. Haydock made no attempt to compose himself or deny the accusations that hung in the air between them, instead remaining seated with the hollow resignation of someone whose elaborate performance had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. "Inspector," Miss Marple began with her characteristic gentleness, "I believe Dr. Haydock has something he wishes to tell you about Mrs. Fortescue's death. The evidence, I'm afraid, points quite clearly to a crime far more complex than we initially supposed." Her knitting needles continued their steady rhythm as she outlined the accumulation of details that had led her to this moment of revelation. The physical evidence, when examined with proper attention to detail, painted an unmistakable picture of calculated deception. Young Timothy's description of his mysterious contact, a gentleman with a careful, measured gait and the distinctive scents of disinfectant and metal polish, had initially seemed to point toward Alistair Finch's war injury and military habits. Yet closer observation revealed that these characteristics aligned perfectly with Dr. Haydock's professional environment and his ability to mimic another's distinctive limp for a single evening's performance. The red sealing wax was particularly illuminating, Miss Marple observed, indicating the doctor's desk where traces of crimson still clung to the blotter's edge. The impression lacked the distinctive burr that marked every genuine seal made by Colonel Fortescue's signet ring, a tiny imperfection that someone forging the Colonel's correspondence would either fail to notice or be unable to replicate accurately. Dr. Haydock's access to Greenway's Manor as the family physician had provided the perfect opportunity to substitute Mrs. Fortescue's smelling salts with his lethal preparation. His intimate knowledge of her medical history, Her emotional vulnerabilities and her habit of reaching for relief during distressing moments had enabled him to time the poisoning with surgical precision, ensuring that her collapse would appear to result from shock rather than chemical intervention. The missing 2 days when Mrs. Fortescue couldn't find her smelling salts coincided exactly with your last professional visit to the manor, Miss Marple continued, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated evidence. Just long enough for someone with the proper chemical knowledge to modify the contents and return the bottle to where it would be conveniently discovered on the hall table. Inspector Slack listened with growing comprehension as the elaborate scheme unfolded before him. The forged letter with its emotional manipulation, the perfectly timed appearance of the Colonel's cufflink, and the systematic misdirection toward Finch as the obvious suspect all demonstrated a mind capable of both medical precision and psychological manipulation. Dr. Haydock's confession, when it finally came, carried the particular exhaustion of a man whose long-carried burden had become unbearable. She was going to expose everything, he said quietly, his professional authority replaced by raw vulnerability. The family papers she planned to donate contained correspondence about the military inquiry that destroyed Finch's career. My role in the cover-up, the false testimony I gave to protect both the Colonel and my own position, it was all there, documented in letters I thought had been destroyed decades ago. The story that emerged revealed not malicious intent, but the desperate self-preservation of a young medical officer whose career had depended on supporting his superior's version of events. Colonel Fortescue had protected him then, but the price of that protection had been complicity in an injustice that had haunted him for decades. Mrs. Fortescue never suspected my involvement, he continued with bitter irony. She genuinely believed she was honoring her husband's memory by making those documents public. She had no idea that her noble intentions would destroy not just Finch's carefully guarded privacy, but my own reputation and livelihood. The methodical precision with which he had planned the murder revealed the particular horror of a crime committed by someone whose professional training had equipped him with intimate knowledge of both human vulnerabilities and chemical possibilities. The cyanide compounds introduced into the smelling salts, the psychological shock of the forged letter, and his presence as the attending physician had allowed him to control the narrative from the very beginning. As Inspector Slack completed the formalities of arrest, the surgery filled with the quiet dignity of tragedy acknowledged. Dr. Haydock offered no resistance, instead accepting his fate with the composed resignation of someone whose performance had finally ended. The news of Dr. Haydock's arrest sent shockwaves through St. Mary Mead, unlike any the village had experienced in living memory. The betrayal felt by the community was profound. Their trusted physician, the man who had delivered their children and tended their ailments, revealed as a calculating murderer. Mrs. Clement stood speechless at her post office counter, while Mrs. Price Ridley found her usual pronouncements inadequate to the enormity of the revelation. Miss Marple gathered her knitting as the afternoon drew to its close, her mind already turning toward the task of helping the village community process this shocking discovery. The investigation that had begun with a mysterious letter delivered after midnight had revealed not merely a single crime, but the complex web of human weakness and fear that could transform ordinary people into instruments of tragedy, reminding her once again that evil often wore the most respectable of masks. The days following Dr. Haydock's confession settled over St. Mary Mead with the peculiar weight that accompanies the complete reversal of fundamental assumptions about trust and respectability. Miss Marple observed the village's collective struggle to reconcile the gentle physician they had known with the calculating murderer, whose elaborate deception had nearly succeeded in destroying an innocent man while claiming a life with surgical precision. Inspector Slack's methodical search of the surgery revealed the full scope of the doctor's preparation, each piece of evidence confirming Miss Marple's careful deductions. The stolen documents from Mr. Pemberton's office lay hidden behind a false panel in the medicine cabinet, their edges singed from a hasty attempt at destruction that had been abandoned when footsteps approached. The missing letter from Mrs. Fortescue's reticule, still bearing traces of red sealing wax, was discovered pressed between pages of an anatomical atlas, its incriminating contents preserved by the very medical knowledge that had enabled the crime. Most damning of all was the small bottle labeled as harmless tincture that carried the unmistakable scent of bitter almonds, along with the box of red wax pellets whose composition matched the residue found throughout the investigation. Dr. Haydock offered no further protest when confronted with this evidence, accepting his fate with the weary resignation of someone whose performance had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. Geoffrey Fortescue emerged from suspicion with a complex mixture of relief and guilt that would shadow his inheritance for years to come. His aunt's death had indeed benefited him financially, yet the knowledge that he had been deliberately positioned as a suspect created a burden that money could not ease. His conversations with Mr. Pemberton revealed genuine distress at having been manipulated so thoroughly. His nervous behavior during the investigation now understood as the natural response of someone sensing danger without comprehending its true source. Alistair Finch received the news of his vindication with the stoic dignity of a man whose bitterness had been forged by decades of undeserved shame. The family papers that Mrs. Fortescue had intended to donate contained not only evidence of Dr. Haydock's perjury, but correspondence revealing that Colonel Fortescue had privately acknowledged Finch's courage while publicly supporting the official version that destroyed his career. This revelation provided cold comfort to someone whose life had been shaped by institutional betrayal, yet it offered the possibility of historical justice, even if personal restoration remained impossible. Young Timothy Marsh struggled to comprehend his unwitting role in the tragedy, his innocent desire to earn pocket money having been exploited by someone who understood exactly how to manipulate a child's eagerness to please authority figures. Miss Marple spent considerable time with the boy, helping him understand that his honesty had ultimately served justice, transforming him from unwitting accomplice to crucial witness in exposing the truth. The village's response manifested in the particular way small communities process collective trauma, through careful reconstruction of past events and gradual acknowledgement of signs that should have been recognized earlier. Mrs. Clement found herself reviewing every interaction with Dr. Haydock, searching for indications of deception hidden beneath his professional manner. Mrs. Price Ridley, her usual certainty shaken by the magnitude of her misjudgment, retreated into uncharacteristic silence as she contemplated how thoroughly appearances had deceived them all. Mrs. Fortescue's funeral proceeded with the dignified restraint she would have preferred, the vicar speaking of charity and resolve, while the community grappled with the knowledge that their trusted physician had violated the most sacred bonds of medical ethics. The service carried an undercurrent of collective bewilderment as neighbors who had entrusted their lives to Dr. Haydock's care struggled to reconcile their memories with the reality of his calculated betrayal. The technical aspects of the crime, revealed through forensic analysis and confession, demonstrated the sophisticated knowledge required to transform innocent medical aid into a lethal weapon. The cyanide compounds had been introduced with precise understanding of both chemistry and human physiology, calculated to produce rapid death while maintaining the appearance of natural cardiac arrest, revealing not merely criminal intent, but a fundamental corruption of the healing arts. As weeks passed and initial shocks subsided, St. Mary Mead began the slow process of rebuilding its equilibrium, though something cautious remained in the air. A new understanding that respectability could serve as an excellent disguise for malevolence. Miss Marple, observing this transformation from her customary chair beneath the elm tree, reflected on how often wickedness borrowed the manners of kindness to ease its way into unsuspecting communities. The investigation had revealed not merely a single act of murder, but a pattern of deception stretching back through decades, touching lives and destroying futures with the persistent malevolence of secrets that refused to remain buried. Villages, Miss Marple mused, ran on small economies of trust and routine, but so did crimes, requiring only the patience to exploit familiar patterns and the cold calculation to transform everyday vulnerabilities into weapons. In the evening quiet of her sitting room, Miss Marple's kettle sang its familiar song as she prepared her customary tea. Yet beneath the household sounds she could almost hear the faint rustle of old letters and the decisive click of a reticule closing, the sort of sounds that begin and end tragedies in places that never intended to house them, reminding her once again that evil often wore the most respectable of masks, while human nature remained both the most fascinating and dangerous subject of all. Now, generate the final section of the story, ensuring a satisfying resolution. Maintain the logical progression of clues and character arcs, delivering the final reveal smoothly while keeping the ending impactful and true to the detective style. The autumn that settled over St. Mary Mead brought with it the particular melancholy that follows extraordinary events, though the village had begun to find its rhythm again with the resilient adaptability that marks small communities confronted with profound change. Miss Marple sat in her garden on a crisp October morning, watching the last roses of the season bloom with defiant beauty against the approaching winter, her mind turning over the final threads of the case that had so thoroughly shaken their peaceful community. Dr. Haydock's trial had concluded with the inevitable verdict, his confession and the overwhelming evidence leaving little room for legal maneuvering. The proceedings had captivated national attention. The story of a trusted village physician turned calculating murderer striking at fundamental assumptions about respectability and trust. Yet for St. Mary Mead, the sensation brought no satisfaction, only the bitter knowledge that their faith had been so thoroughly betrayed by someone they had welcomed into their most intimate moments of vulnerability. The village's response manifested in subtle but unmistakable ways. Mrs. Clement now examined every piece of correspondence with forensic intensity, as though expecting another harbinger of doom hidden among the Daily Post. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose confident pronouncements had been so thoroughly mistaken, had grown uncharacteristically thoughtful, her usual certainty replaced by a chastened awareness that appearances could deceive even the most observant among them. The new physician, a competent young woman whose professional manner carried none of the intimate familiarity that had made Dr. Haydock's betrayal so devastating, found herself working to earn trust that would never again be granted automatically. Geoffrey Fortescue had surprised everyone, perhaps most of all himself, by transforming his inheritance into something meaningful beyond personal gain. The establishment of a trust fund for young men whose military service had left them damaged and forgotten by the institutions they had served represented a profound change from the dissolute heir who had once seemed interested only in his quarterly allowance. His aunt's death had indeed benefited him financially, but the knowledge of how thoroughly he had been manipulated, positioned as a suspect in an elaborate game of deception, had awakened something genuine within him. Alistair Finch received his vindication with the stoic dignity of a man whose bitterness had been forged by decades of undeserved shame. The family papers revealed not cowardice, but extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances, his disgrace the result of institutional corruption rather than personal failure. While official exoneration could not restore his lost years or repair the damage to his spirit, it provided a measure of justice that had been denied for far too long. He began to tend his roses with slightly less bitterness, occasionally exchanging civil words with neighbors who now saw him as a tragic figure rather than a resentful recluse. Young Timothy Marsh had recovered from his unwitting involvement with the resilience of youth, though Miss Marple occasionally caught him studying adults with a wariness that had not been there before his encounter with calculated deception. Geoffrey's offer of a small scholarship had been accepted with the serious gratitude of a boy who understood that knowledge carried both power and responsibility. His experience had taught him that authority figures were not automatically trustworthy, a lesson both valuable and sad for someone so young to learn. The Historical Society had indeed received Mrs. Fortescue's intended donation, though under circumstances far different from what she had envisioned. The documents that exposed decades of institutional corruption served her cause of historical accuracy, while revealing the complex web of complicity that had destroyed one man's honor to protect another's reputation. Her death had ultimately served the cause of justice she had unknowingly championed, though at a cost far greater than she could have imagined. As winter approached and the investigation became village history, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the particular psychology of crimes that grew from legitimate grievances, transformed by time and isolation into something far more dangerous. Dr. Haydock's original complicity in the military cover-up had been born of career preservation rather than malicious intent. Yet his inability to face the consequences of that youthful compromise had eventually led him to murder an innocent woman whose only crime had been a commitment to historical truth. The case had demonstrated once again that the most dangerous criminals were often those who moved freely within respectable society, using their very respectability as both weapon and shield. Medical knowledge, professional authority, and community trust had all been perverted in service of an elaborate deception that had nearly succeeded in destroying an innocent man while claiming a life with surgical precision. On quiet evenings when the village settled into its familiar rhythms, Miss Marple would sometimes reflect on the letter delivered after midnight that had set these tragic events in motion. The mysterious correspondence had been designed to exploit grief and vulnerability for murderous purposes, yet it had ultimately served to expose the very secrets it was meant to protect, demonstrating once again that truth possessed a persistence that could outlast even the most elaborate deceptions. The elm tree in the church green continued to shade the spot where Mrs. Fortescue had collapsed, its branches now bare against the autumn sky, but carrying within them the promise of spring's return. Villages, like seasons, moved in cycles of loss and renewal, accommodating tragedy while maintaining the essential rhythms that made life possible. Miss Marple gathered her knitting as the afternoon light faded, knowing that St. Mary Mead would endure, its capacity for both human frailty and ultimate redemption serving as a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, patient observation and gentle persistence could still triumph over calculated evil, bringing justice to those who had been denied it and peace to communities that had learned, once again, that wickedness could indeed wear the most respectable of faces.